This video is sponsored by Squarespace. I had so much fun making dungeon tiles in our previous video that I thought I would extend the concept and make some Wylock style clip-on walls for our dungeon tile system. In this video, we'll be using all of the same supplies and techniques that we used to make the dungeon tiles, so once again, these will be very cheap and beginner-friendly to make. So long story short, we're going to be using the same 3-inch square wooden tiles that we used for the dungeon tiles to create some walls. This will save us a ton of time measuring things to make sure they're perfectly square. Don't have to do any of that with this method, and we also won't have to worry about if they're going to fit with the original tiles because they're the same size. To get started, we're going to use the same technique that we used for the dungeon tiles, gluing whatever tiles we want directly onto the foam core for our single walls, and gluing 2 or more next to each other to create longer wall sections. Just like we did with the dungeon tiles, we're going to cover these with some books overnight, and then cut them out with our X-Acto blades first thing in the morning. For adding some texture to our walls, we're going to be using the same basic technique that we used for the dungeon tiles, cutting V-grooves into the foam core to add texture to our walls. But instead of just covering our walls with random stonework like we did with the tiles, I feel like it's important for the walls to be just a little bit more specific. As you can see, if we applied the same texture to the walls that we applied to the floor, it doesn't quite look like walls, it just looks like we turned the floors sideways. So much like our dungeon tiles, I want to have our walls reflect the most common setting in my personal D&D campaign, which are the sewers and abandoned tunnelways below the deep and mysterious Howl City. So I decided to go with a mixture of influences, combining old sewer brickwork with modern subway tiles. And to get started, just like the dungeon tiles, we're going to draw the pattern that we want to carve out first in pencil on our foam. And this is going to require just a little bit more finesse with your ruler than the standard dungeon tiles, but I believe in you and I think you can do it. To start out, using your ruler, create marks every ½ inch along each side of the tile. This will serve as our basic grid of ½ inch marks, which we're going to use to build everything else on the tile. Next, using our ruler and the measurement marks we just made, we're going to frame the archway, starting with a ½ inch thick column on each side, and then roughly marking in 2 lines along the top 2 ½ inches, which we will then use as guides to draw the archway. To draw the archway, we're going to start on one side, a full inch down from the top of the tile, and draw our archway to the highest point, which will be right in the center horizontally, and a ½ inch down vertically. We then mirror this on the other side, creating an archway. Once complete, you can erase some of the guidelines we just made, and then we can move on to drawing the inner brickwork. To do this, using your ruler, simply draw a line across every ½ inch, using our ½ inch marks as a guide, and then to make the bricks even smaller, draw a line down the center of each of these ½ inches, creating many rows of ½ inch tall bricks. After this, to create the individual bricks, we are once again going to use our ½ inch marks as a guide, and we're going to draw a line each ½ inch mark on every second row of bricks. Then to create the alternate row of bricks, simply draw a line roughly halfway between each of the previous brick marks, but this time on the alternating rows. With our bricks complete, we can move on to adding details to the archway. First, we're going to draw a matching curve, roughly at the ½ inch marks at the very top corners of the tile. We're going to use this to border the archway, and once this is done, we can draw the individual blocks. For the blocks on the side column, start a full inch down from the top, and then draw a line not exactly there, but instead at the center of the next brick down. Then draw another line 1/2 inch down from there, and repeat until you reach the bottom of the wall. We're going to do this on both sides of the archway, and then move on to adding in the bricks on the top of the archway. For the top, start by drawing in the keystone of the archway in the center. We're going to make this about ½ inch in width, but tapered towards the bottom. And once this is done, we're going to draw 2 matching wedges of about the same size on each side. Finally, subdivide each remaining curve shape into 3, and you're done. Well, you're done drawing the pattern, anyway. We still have to carve out the actual texture on the walls. And if you found any of those drawing instructions unclear or hard to follow, Don't worry, because I've also provided a diagram with full measurements over at howlcorp.com/dungeon tiles. And it was extremely quick and easy to do this using this video's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one website and hosting platform that I've been using for a decade now for all of my website creation needs. And you can do pretty much anything with Squarespace. Simply select a template that looks good to you, add as many modules as you might like, and arrange the elements on the page however you might want using their fantastic new grid system. I've been using Squarespace for my own personal hobby website over the past year, to house all of my hobby reference documents, hobby progress, as well as my very own merch shop. And I've been really happy with how it's worked for me so far. So if you'd like to make your own website for less than the cost of a monthly Netflix subscription, check out squarespace.com today for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch your page, go to squarespace.com/DanaHowell for 10% off your very first purchase of a website or domain. And now, back to the video. Now that we've got our pattern drawn out, it's time to carve the texture using our handy X-Acto knife and a sharp blade, and we're going to use this to cut texture into the walls using all the lines that we just drew as our guides. I like to cut out the archway first, cutting each wall using the same V-cut technique that we used for our dungeon tiles, and then carefully do the same thing but in a curved way to the upper archway. After this, it's time to cut out each individual brick. And while this may seem a little tedious, I really like the results it gives, and I find brick carving is one of my favorite side activities to do while watching TV in the evenings with my partner and my lovely dog. I like to start with the larger blocks of the archway using deeper cuts for these, and then move on to the inner brickwork, cutting shallower lines along each row of bricks, and then cutting single vertical lines to separate each row into individual bricks. As you're cutting all these lines, remember to forgive yourself for past sins, and remember that imperfection is the goal here, and not to be avoided. Each brick is an imperfect but perfect creation, and each mistake adds to a more perfectly imperfect, lifelike end result. It should go without saying that you will get faster and better at this as you go, so remember that your first few pancakes, or dungeon walls in this case, might end up a little bit burnt, but that's totally okay and to be expected. With our texturing complete, let's move on to the clip-on feature. And as with everything in this series, this clip-on feature is inspired by the clip-on walls of the fantastic Wylock from Wylock's Armory, so make sure to check out his channel and all of his fantastic dungeon builds. So basically, we just want these to clip onto the sides of our existing tiles, and the easiest way that I have found to do this is to just remove the foam in the area where the tile will want to rest. Conveniently, our tiles are about 1/4 inch in thickness, and we've already drawn and textured a 1/4 inch row of bricks onto our wall in that area. So all we have to do here is, using our X-Acto blade, remove the bottom row of bricks from our wall, and try your best to keep this row intact as you cut it out. As right after this, we're going to glue it back onto the wall, just 1/4 inch up from where it used to be. This has the effect of creating a nice bit of baseboard for our wall, as well as creating more friction to keep our clip-on wall in place in whatever tile we want to put it on. I found that I prefer to use tacky glue for this step, as it's a little bit tougher and dries faster, but if all you have is white PVA glue, that will work just fine too, just give it a little bit more time to dry. For the other side of our clip-on feature, we're going to need something on the bottom and back of the tile. And for this, I'm going full Wylock and just using plain old cereal box cardboard, or in my case, specifically, snack cake cardboard. But obviously, whatever you have on hand that's about this thickness is totally fine. Just make sure it doesn't have any food on it. Once you've got this on hand, cut out a strip that's about 1.5 inches or more in width, and then fold it in half lengthwise. I find that scoring it lightly with an X-Acto blade and ruler on the opposite side that you're going to be folding it makes this much easier. We're going to then cut down the sides of this thing to a piece that's about the length of our wall and glue it to the bottom and the back of our wall tile at a roughly 45-degree angle. If it's not sticking, feel free to add a little bit more glue and use heavy things to keep everything in place while it dries. Once this is dry, it should clip on and off of any of your floor tiles quite easily. And if it doesn't for some reason, you probably just need to add some more friction or glue at one of the points. After you've made a few of these, you should kind of get the idea of how much friction you need. After this, you can add a little bit of texture to the baseboards if you want, and then all that's left is to paint up our tiles using the same method that we used for the dungeon tiles. But there is one more thing we should probably figure out before we paint these up, and that is corners. Or more specifically, what do we want to do at corners where two walls meet? As you can see in the current state of things, it doesn't really work. There's a massive gap here, and it doesn't quite look right. So I tried the solution used by the Dungeons and Lasers dungeon tiles line, which I quite like, and trimmed each wall at a roughly 45-degree angle. And this sort of worked. There's much less of a gap now, and aesthetically, I think the tapered edges look cool even when not used in a corner, but there is still this tiny gap left when two walls meet, and while it does bother me, for now I'm just going to put up with it, and in the future I'm going to build some sort of a corner clip, I think, that masks the join. So stay tuned for future videos if that's the sort of exciting thing you want to see me do. I painted up these walls using the exact same method and recipe as in the first Dungeon Tiles video. I'm going to assume that if you're watching this video, you've probably seen that one. So go and watch that video again if you want a quick review on how I painted up those dungeon tiles. And that's about it. That's how I've decided to build dungeon walls for my dungeon tile system. You can, of course, repeat this process on the other side of a wall if you want double-sided walls. For me, I don't think that's going to come up a lot, so I probably will just make a few of those. And you can, of course, add any sort of extra bits and stuff that you want to the walls if you want to add a little bit more interest or flavor. If you have any questions about this method of making dungeon tiles and dungeon walls, make sure to leave those down in the description and I'll do my best to answer as many questions as I can. And definitely let me know if you want to see more entries in this series and what you would like to see me build next. As always, thank you to all of our lovely patrons for supporting this channel. It really means a lot to me. And this week, I would especially like to thank Sharon Starnes for supporting the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.